Plenty of folks. Sweet.
Oh, yeah.
Exciting.
There.
Yeah.
Should we go ahead and get started then? People
Yeah.
can roll in as they get here. I think that'll work out just fine. Cool. Well, so welcome everybody to the first episode of Outdoor Perspectives. My name is Xander, and I'm from Outdoor Adventures. And then my co-host tonight is going to be Tomiko.
Hi, my name is Tomika, and I am from Mixed Student Union.
Cool. So the Outdoor Adventures program here at UC Davis started the DEI, which is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, this past year, basically to address systemic barriers to access in the outdoors. So a lot of the work that we've been doing has been largely internal and about addressing like policies within our program to improve access and improve who comes on our trips and who guides with us. But we wanted to create the series to provide an opportunity to engage other people in this conversation as well, and to engage the larger outdoor community and the UC Davis community about what it means to be an inclusive organization and an inclusive outdoor community and what benefits can come from that. So we started this Outdoor Perspective Speaker Series to center voices of individuals who may not ordinarily be at the center of these spaces. And we're super excited to have Vasu here first, and I'll let Tomiko introduce Vasu.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here, excited. Thank you, Xander, for reaching out. And I have the pleasure of introducing Vasu, who is a really awesome adaptive athlete, and really glad to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me, for sure. Xander, do you have more to say before I?
No, I was just going to say that if anybody would like to have closed captions to read along with, there's an option on the bottom right of your screen where you can hit live transcript, and that'll pop some subtitles up for those of you who would like that.
Cool. Sweet. Well, yeah, let me get started here. I'll just share my screen and I can intro myself as well, and then kind of go into it. The presentation is about, hopefully, sometimes I go over because I talk too much, but around 50 or so minutes, and then hopefully we can open it up to questions to everyone based on what I presented. So I would love to also use the chat feature a little bit. So the folks that are in this, if you would like, just to intro yourself, your first and last name, and then your pronouns that you go by, as well as one activity that you really like when you're outside. It doesn't have to be under the typical outdoorsy realm, but just something that you really like doing when you're outside. Just so we can stay a little bit engaged throughout this entire conversation and kind of just see what other people really like to do. Feel free to do that. And while that's happening, I'll intro myself. So the presentation I like to chat about a little bit is reframing disability, and specifically in the outdoors. So as Xander and Tomika put it, is Outdoor Perspectives is the name of the series that you all are putting on. And my name is, again, Vasu Sojitra. My pronouns are he, him. With every presentation I try to do a non-native land acknowledgement. So with that, we travel and recreate and visit on the stolen lands that is known as Turtle Island by many. I'm on the native land of the Crow, Northern Cheyenne, Salish Kootenai, Shoshone Bannock, Blackfeet, and many others that call Bozeman, Montana home. And we want us to build, respect, and acknowledge the original stewards, our native communities that call this land and water home since time immemorial, for which we have to continue to fight for justice. And I will talk a little bit about how disability and native cultures intersect, along with a lot of other topics around intersectionality when it comes specifically, again, to disability. So wanted to provide that as we move forward. Let's see. There we are. So a little bit about my background is I was actually born in Connecticut at Hartford Hospital, and I contracted a blood infection in my right leg called septicemia at the age of 9 months old. And based on that, they had to amputate it, or it was a very serious blood infection. So it would have killed me if they didn't amputate my right leg. My right leg is amputated pretty close to my hip. I have about 2 or 3 inches of femur left. And based off of that, I was in the hospital for several months. Once I got out of the hospital, my parents and brother and I decided to move back to India, to Gujarat, where my lineage and my heritage is. I'm Indian American. And to get some more family support around, a newborn that just went through a massive traumatic experience. Was in Gujarat from the ages of 2 to 7. And I was growing, I was playing outside, playing football, as we like to call it, American soccer, and just a lot of different games with some of the neighbor kids. I was constantly breaking my prosthetic leg, and my parents decided to move back to Connecticut. They had the opportunity to do so. And we moved back to Connecticut, where we could have a little bit more access to that medical equipment for me. And that was around the age of 7. Here's a little photo of me from India. I love this photo. It's me petting a monkey. I would highly recommend never touching any of these monkeys in India. They're really aggressive. They will probably bite you or scratch you. I'm surprised my parents were letting me do this, because these things are very aggressive, but this always brings me back home, with a few of the rickshaws in the back, and me just chilling. And you can kind of see I have one leg, but it's kind of hidden. But yeah, so this is a little nice nostalgic photo. Based off of that, I started skiing around the age of 10, and I taught myself. This was in Connecticut, so I was mostly at a local ski hill called Ski Sundown, and then went up to Vermont, fell in love with Vermont, decided to go to the University of Vermont, where I studied mechanical engineering, and started getting connected with Vermont Adaptive right at the end of my college career, where I started falling in love with adaptive sports, which is a whole new world if folks aren't aware, but I'll talk about it a little bit later. But the adaptive sports world is what hooked me in, kind of completely switched careers from mechanical engineering to adaptive recreation. A buddy of mine wanted to go out to Bozeman, Montana after we graduated, and I connected with what is called Eagle Mount Bozeman, where I became the adaptive sports director for our ski program here at the local ski area called Bridger Bowl. So got kind of thrown right into it. Most people thought I was an intern because I was 23 when I started working there as their assistant director, and then became their director at the age of, I believe, 25. Stayed there for about 6 years while I was still building my career as an athlete. And now I'm sponsored by these 5 companies. North Face, of course, most people are aware of. Anon Goggles, or Anon Optics, Skull Candy, Hydro Flask, and Faction Skis. So those are my main sponsors that help me ski pretty much as a career. Wanted to talk a little bit about adaptive skiing. And simply put, adaptive skiing is skiing and riding for people with disabilities. There's various different forms of adaptive skiing. So the first one is called biski with a tether. You can see an individual in what is called an umbrella term of sit skiing. And this one is specifically a bi-ski sit ski. There's 2 skis on the bottom, and the individual is holding 2 handheld outriggers, which are pretty much forearm crutches with little skis on the bottom, which is being tethered by an instructor to help turn, help slow down, kind of be that control. You can, one would say, graduate or be more independent without the tethers, and that's called just by skiing. This individual is skiing all on their own through some fresh powder, it looks like, and with those same handheld outriggers. There's also something called, oh, there we go, a snow slider or ski legs. In this photo, there is that same individual with the tethers, with the brakes and the turning, but they are tethering what is called a snow slider, which is kind of like a walker with skis attached to it. So this is more for folks with what is called hemiplegia, or might have suffered a stroke, might have cerebral palsy. Various different kinds of disabilities can use any of these equipments. This is a little bit more constrictive. You're kind of strapped to this rig, and don't have too much mobility when you're in it. So, but it's more for folks that are able to stand for a longer period of time. So that's another form for folks with more support needs. There's something called stand-up tether. Again, that volunteer is holding onto tethers, controlling the speed and turning a little bit, trying to engage the student to turn on their own. As you can see, the tethers are connected to the front of their skis this time. So again, helping with that stopping, braking, and turning. And that's, again, more for folks that are able to stand on their own and, have a little bit more independence with that. There's also, well, there we go, what many people might have already seen, mono skiing, which is a pretty high intense adrenaline sport. Of course, it comes with its own variations of abilities, from the bunny hill to the Olympic platform. So this individual is in a race mono ski. He also looks like he has a bilateral amputation of both his legs, or both their legs. And you can see that they're also using 2 handheld outriggers to help them turn and ski and stay balanced. And then there is a little lag, sorry, something called blind skiing as well. So folks that have visual impairments or blind folks that are out there are also able to ski. This is a horse and buggy method. You can see 2 volunteers or instructors are kind of the sandwich, and the blind skier, the visual impaired skier, is in the middle, holding on to 2 of the bamboo poles, and they're kind of just like getting guided down the hill left and right. There's also one of my friends who's also a blind skier, just uses a cowbell, and the instructor is just in front of him, ringing the cowbell and turning, which is kind of really entertaining to watch, because he does an amazing job at skiing just through a cowbell, which is really cool. Another one, which most people might see in the adaptive world, we call 2-tracking. And simply put, the 2 skis make 2 tracks in the snow, so we call it 2-tracking. And this is more for, again, a lot of independent skiers. As you can see, there's no other equipment other than the skis and boots, and the individual is skiing all on their own, with a little bit of guidance and instruction from that instructor in front of them. There's 4-tracking. That's 2 skis and 2 handheld outriggers, which, as you can imagine, make 4 tracks in the snow. So this individual is looks like skiing some aggressive groomers here with their handheld outriggers. And this is more for folks that might be using, crutches on a daily basis, or be able to use their legs a little bit more, have some quad control, hamstring control, but might have some balance issues. If it is a very low spinal cord injury, anything like that, or a lower leg amputation, something along the lines of that, so that they use those handheld outriggers. And this is what we call one sec, slowly. What we call 3-tracking, and that's what I do. It's 1 ski and 2 handheld outriggers. I've also reframed it to be called ninja sticking. If many of you follow me on Instagram, that's kind of been my tag for anything and everything I do outside, along with skateboarding. So this is a form of adaptive skiing, and different things I've created, and this is based out of my engineering degree, is these snowshoe basket attachments that go to the bottom of those outriggers. and they have little teeth and they grab, and they're made of plastic that create the track that you are seeing on the left side. You can see a little track with my touring ski, which has a skin on the bottom, a touring skin, which helps me go uphill, and then my outriggers that help me move uphill as well. So, and then on the far right, you can see something what I've created, invented, is called an adaptive whippet, and it's a ice axe attachment that I've attached with a bracket to my outrigger. So I don't, it's a form of self-arresting myself if I'm on a really steep slope and I need to stop myself from tumbling pretty much to my death. Hopefully not. So that the idea is that whippet, I dig it into the snow and it stops me from falling or sliding down a very steep slope. There is, of course, a con. It's a very sharp tool directly by my thigh. So there's definitely a possibility of stabbing myself in the thigh. So, kind of have to balance the pros and cons there between either stabbing myself or tumbling to my death, or even, more traumatic injury. So, yeah, that's that. Here's more photos of that handheld outrigger. You can see the left side. It's in what is called walk mode. The skis are up, and the bottom of those skis have little screws on them that are helpful to walk on really firm snow or ice. And then the middle photo, you can see the ski or the outrigger is in ski mode with the ice axe attachment at the top. And then the right side is those snowshoe baskets that go on the bottom, which I created actually at the University of Vermont with a bunch of my friends. Where it's taken me is this is a 2,000 plus foot ski line in Yellowstone National Park called Abiathar. Sounds like something out of Game of Thrones. But yeah, it's a super cool line right in the heart of Yellowstone. And it's also just recently, I just put down the first disabled descent of Mount Moran, which is in the northern Tetons of the Skillet Glacier, which is a 6,000 foot top to bottom ski line, and about 45 to 40 degrees in pitch, pretty steep. So that was super cool. Here's another photo of me skiing what is called the Great One here in the Northern Bridgers, another steep couloir with protruding rock that look like Wolverine claws. Super cool, super fun line. And then also, little lag, sorry. Another one is what is called the Ruler here in Northern Bridgers, just next to the Great One. And this is pretty much the width of, or the length of my ski at parts, and a lot of jump turning involved. This was definitely needed I was mostly just needing to get off of this thing because it was about 50 degrees and terrifying to be on. But made it down. I'm talking to you today, sharing these details. It's always a comedy after tragedy. So super cool to be able to ski something like this. Very steep, very tight, very scary. Also, another thing where it's taken me is on stage and my advocacy role around disability, access, intersecting with a lot of racial justice issues, and social justice issues, environmental justice issues, you name it. It all intersects. And that's another part of what I do for work. Is I'm also a diversity and inclusion consultant and strategist for brands to be more inclusive around disabled folks and folks of color and queer folks out there. So trying to create a more inclusive environment in the outdoor industry based off of the knowledge that I have as the adaptive sports director at Eagle Mount, and through various different spaces that I've been able to engage in. With that, this is something I bring up all the time. So whenever I talk about diversity, I talk about these big 8 social identifiers. So there's of course more. I'll talk about few more, that we might run into in our society. But these are the big 8. There's ability, which involves cognitive, mental, and physical. There's age. There's ethnicity, which is, let's say I'm Indian, is my Indian American is my ethnicity. There's gender. There's race, and which would mean that I'm technically Asian American. There's religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and class. So these are the ones that I try to stick by when I'm talking about intersectionality and diversity. And this, of course, conversation is more around the disability side, but trying to involve all 8 of these and more into any of these conversations whenever I talk about justice and inclusion. Another thing I like to bring up is intersectionality. And you can see on the left side with the stick figure that there's others like education, there's culture, there's language, there's immigration status. So all of these things start incorporating ourselves into the privilege and how we navigate our society. So intersectionality was coined by a Black woman in the 80s named Kimberly Crenshaw. And I really highly recommend folks to listen to her podcast called Intersectionality Now. But the way she's phrased it and the way it's evolved is it's a lens, a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts. And it's kind of like a layer, it's like an onion, all of these identities. And each comes with its own privileges and its own powers, and I'll go into that a little bit more. Ways that they've showed up in the ski world for me is something called Brotherhood of Skiing, a massive organization that actually started in the 60s, late 60s, right around the Black Panther movement. And they were kind of succinct when they were creating their organization. Highly recommend folks to watch the film called Brotherhood of Skiing that REI put out there. A few of my friends actually directed that. Faith Briggs, she's a Black woman based out of Portland, doing some amazing work around inclusion, helped produce and direct that film. Really cool narrative around Black skiers in the industry and just needing to have their voices be heard for years and years. Another one is the Latinx and Hispanic communities in primarily mountain towns, but also many other towns as well. But in mountain towns, they're the ones that pretty much are the essential workers that we keep saying during COVID. They're the ones that clean, and they're the ones that cook. They're the ones that are doing a lot of the behind the scenes work, and they just are not represented on the ski hill because skiing is so expensive to a lot of folks. And a lot of Hispanic communities, migrant workers, are primarily trying to survive in winter and just trying to make it through harsh winters and stuff like that. So, trying to make sure that they're elevated, their communities are taken care of as well. There's also a spectrum of class. A lot of folks skiing in jeans, skiing in Carhartts, hiking in sandals, you name it, right? It's like all over the place. It doesn't really matter. The outdoor industry has created this model that you have to look a certain way to be outdoorsy, and that's complete BS. Humans are born to be outside. We are part of the ecosystem. It doesn't matter what you wear or dress as long as you're safe and able to make it back home in one piece. So that's kind of the idea here. All of them are having fun, it looks like, and having a blast soaking in the sun and the powder. Another one, of course, and I talked about earlier, is adaptive skiing. And that's, again, for folks with disabilities. You can see these two individuals. One is in a bi-ski with handheld outriggers, and the other is in a monoski with handheld outriggers. So that's a way of how intersectionality has kind of showed itself in the ski world. I also like to show this wheel and power of privilege, wheel, power, and privilege, which incorporates the center being the people and identities, those social identifiers that I talked about, that we mostly see in media, that we mostly see in leadership, that are mostly represented when making these bigger decisions. And then the folks on the margins are the ones whose voices aren't heard as often, aren't seen on the big screen, aren't seen in media, aren't seen in leadership, making the big decisions around not just their own bodies, but bodies of all these marginalized identities as well. So we're seeing a ton of anti-trans bills happening around the country. We're seeing a lot of mental health crisis happening, a lot of homelessness, so a lot of that happening all over the country, and a lot of it's not being taken care of in the way it needs to. So I always like to bring this up, a great resource. Sylvia Duckworth is a great person to follow on social media as well. And don't worry, I'm going to send this presentation as a PDF to the organizers, and they're more than welcome to send it out to anyone, so you can keep track. Ways I talk about disability. So one of those pies, two of those pies. So if you go back, there's neurodiversity in the bottom right and ability in the yellow. So those are two different ways disability kind of shows up. Also, mental health shows up in that sense as well, mental illness. So these are different ways that I talk about disability. It is a big umbrella term. So there's physical, so something like a spinal cord injury, cognitive, like something like autism or Down syndrome, mental illness, something like bipolar or anxiety, sick or chronic illness like diabetes or other heart diseases. Are different ways that I talk about disability, not just my own as someone with an amputation, but in a more general term. So another way I bring up disability, and a lot of disability justice folks bring up disability, is that it's not one or the other. Just like gender is a spectrum, just like socioeconomics is a spectrum, just like sexual orientation is a spectrum, all these things are a spectrum. Disability is a spectrum as well. And it's a spectrum when it comes to living independently, and how are we providing the support that an individual needs to live an independent life that is also not just independent entirely from our entire ecosystem, but also providing more interdependency, so we are all working together. So maybe many of you on this presentation might identify in that lower support needs. You're able to feed yourself, you're able to pay rent, you're able to drive yourself, you're able to go to class yourself, all these things that you're able to do yourself. And then there's others on the higher support needs that might need someone like a caregiver at home to help them go to the bathroom or help them eat. So there's different ways. I'm more like, on that lower support need spectrum, but I can climb mountains all day, every day, but I still need help from my friends and random community members to carry my water and food to the table whenever I go out to eat. So all those things that come into play around disability. Another reframing of disability that I like to talk about, that is, disability is this conflict between ability and barrier. So everyone has an ability. Everyone is born with a certain ability, whether we like to push it or not, that doesn't make the biggest difference, but it's those barriers that we come into or in contact with. So metaphorical staircases that we come into. So I'll talk about a few more later, but that's a barrier that kind of starts identifying an ability as a disability for some folks that use medical equipment. So that's a way of looking at it. There's a lot of different barriers, of course, when it comes to media, when it comes to physical barriers, when it comes to random stigmas as well. So yeah. And again, just like I said before, we have to look at disability not in terms of health, but as a mismatch between ability and the designed environment. A great resource right there. It's a nice article around this specific sentence of how to provide universal design into our everyday lives, not just physically, but mentally, cognitively, emotionally, all of it. A few little stats around disability. So disabled folks are the largest minority in the world. We make up of around 15% of the world population, again, based on those 4 different physical, mental, cognitive, ill and sick categories. So a lot can fall under that. In the US, it's around closer to 20%, around 60 million people. So that's a lot. COVID has increased that heavily, let's just say. Some temporary, some not. Some actually have some lasting residual disabilities based off of COVID. And then on average, this is more for income, which also equates to someone's well-being and livelihood in our capitalist country. So average income for a person with a disability is approximately $20,000 compared to approximately $30,000 for a person without a disability. And then approximately 10.5% of people with disabilities are unemployed compared to 4.6% of people without disabilities. And of course, COVID has exacerbated those numbers for both populations, both disabled and non-disabled. So those are different during this past year, but it can kind of conceptualize where we're at around disability. Incorporating race into it, a lot of Black and African Americans are impacted with poverty, and as well as Hispanic and just in general total. So, things to look out for there. It does impact disability and the status of socioeconomic status is impacted by race as well. So there's a lot of racism involved in causing more inequity for disabled folks. So another great resource right there as well, if you are interested in reading about more of that financial hit to disabled folks, would recommend reading that as well. Another thing, so all that kind of incorporates into this term what we like to say as ableism. And ableism is the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defies people by their disability. Like racism and sexism, ableism classifies entire groups of people as less than and includes harmful stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations of people with disabilities. Again, yes, another form of oppression towards disabled folks. Highly recommend reading that resource as well to dive deeper into what ableism is and how it impacts us all on a day-to-day life. Ways that it shows up in the outdoors. In the ski world, we call it Jerry bashing. So that's making fun of newbies, folks that don't dress a certain way, act a certain way within a culture around hiking or skiing or climbing, you name it. Ways that also show up. Slowest hiker is miles back. So, tends to be, typically, folks of a larger body size, a disabled person such as myself. I'm always in the back of the pack whenever we're in a group, especially when it comes to ski touring, and not making that time to wait as well. For folks, when we're in these larger groups, it's always nice to be in a group because it's based around building community and building trust and spending time with our friends and building that sense of belonging. And when we don't wait, when we don't hang out together, it causes this exclusionary feeling. So that's another way it shows up. Again, making fun of what someone wears, skiing in jeans, hiking in sandals, not dressing the part, whatever. Not listening to everyone's input on decision making. Everyone processes different situations differently and at different paces. So making sure everyone's input is taken care of and moving forward in a way that helps, push the group, but also make the safe decisions out there when we're, in the backcountry away from some of the societal needs that we've created for ourselves. Something else is forcing someone to ski, ride, hike a trail, a line above their ability. So I know I like to push my friends, but there's a level where it causes more hurt than good, causes more harm than good, causes some trauma. So trying to find that line is based on building these relationships, talking with people, understanding where they're coming from. So that's kind of the idea. These are some ways it shows up. There's a lot of different ways it shows up, but just a few. Let's see slowly. Oh, there we go. Okay, so again, barriers to access. These are things that you might see on a day-to-day basis. So physical, again, those conditions by structural environment that prevents or impedes an individual with a disability from efficiently navigating that setting. So a physical barrier like a door, like a stairway, or staircase, anything like that. Media format. So information that is not available in a processable format for individuals with disabilities. So providing ASL interpreters, providing captioning, Braille, all these things that might come into play. Technology, software, electronics, and physical technologies that are not adapted to assisted devices. Nowadays, pretty much everything is, at least in our world, in the global north. So things to really think about there if you're in that field. Systemic is the biggest one, and I always talk about this, is procedures, protocols, or policies that place undue burden on individuals with disabilities. So a lot of it's based around education, medical, different opportunities around employment, which causes financial issues. So ways that it shows up systemically is such as that. The ADA was a great resource, and it's just the start for providing equitable opportunities for the disability community, as well as the Rehabilitation Act. But these are just different ways to create systemic change, is through policy, procedure, and protocols that help individuals with disabilities find their own successes. And I will always say, there's always this thing that goes around that says disability is like a bad attitude or something like that. It's like, that's not the case. Like, no matter how much we stare at a staircase, like a person with a wheelchair is just not going to be able to go up that unless they're scooting up the staircase. I've had to do that every time I've been injured. So just a different empathy exercise for me whenever I've been able to take part. And then the perception part is false expectations that individuals with disabilities are unable to contribute as much as their peers who have no disability. So again, that stigma around disabled folks need fixing, disabled folks are less than, anything along the lines of that, is definitely things that show up as barriers. Let's see, come on, loading. There we go. So ableism and language. This is another way ableism shows up in our world, is through language. So ableism is not a list of bad words. Language is one tool of an oppressive system. Being aware of language for those of us who have the privilege of being able to change our language can help us understand how pervasive ableism is. Ableism is systematic, institutional devaluing of bodies and minds deemed deviant, abnormal, defective, subhuman, less than. And ableism is violence, and that language is a way of expressing that violence. Again, great resource tool by Autistic Choya. They are an amazing advocate in the disability justice world. Highly recommend reading that. So this is kind of the mindset of that language, where on the left is maybe things that we hear on a daily basis: stand in solidarity, that dude is lame, that line is insane or crazy, the economy is crippled or paralyzed, wheelchair bound, handicapped. So there's ways that we can show up in a non-ableist, anti-ableist way, which is being in solidarity, incompetent instead of lame, bizarre or wild instead of crazy or insane, held back instead of crippled or paralyzed, a wheelchair user instead of wheelchair bound. Wheelchairs usually empower people to live a more independent life. person with a disability, or for me, I like to say disabled person because I view disability as not a bad thing. We've had this stigma around disability being a bad thing. So people like to use people first, which is great, which is fine. But also trying to reclaim that word, just like how the queer community has reclaimed the word queer. Be sure in all cases to accept mistakes in addressing people, but do not over apologize. So hold yourself accountable and make sure you don't make that mistake again. Each person likes to be addressed in a certain way. The best way is to ask. And that's based on consent, not just addressing a certain way, but when they need help and support, always good to ask of like, hey, do you need help? If you do, I'm right here. If you don't, no big deal. We can't take that personally. That's not our thing to take personally, especially around like holding a door or carrying something or, anything like that. So most disabled folks are understanding and know what their limits and capabilities are for the most part. A lot do try to push them, but which is great, way to keep empowering themselves. But just always good to ask when someone needs support. Accessibility outside. Again, equitable language is super important. There's a link to a great resource. Make sure to ski kind. Another great resource that an organization I work with, Winter Wildlands Alliance, came out with, and it can definitely correlate to everyday life, outdoor activities, not just skiing. Hiking together is great. Letting folks wear what they want as long as they're not hurting themselves. Like, I don't really want folks to go barefoot walking, but to each their own. Hopefully they're not hurting themselves. Understanding that we're all novices once in our lives. Jerry's another word for that in the ski world, but understand that some people started skiing at 30 and some people started skiing at 4 years old based on the access they had around those opportunities, those resources, like driving to the mountain, paying for a ski lift ticket, paying for ski gear, all this stuff that adds up. Listening to everyone's input, active listening, ears, heart, and body. A lot of us, everyone actually talks in all ways around our voice and our body language. All these things show us how we react to different situations. So helping working to understand that and being mindful of that. Also being mindful of everyone's ski, ride, hike ability. And always trying to push it a little bit, but not too much, so people aren't deterred away from that activity or from you. So trying to keep that trust. Know before you go. That's more based around avalanches, another good accessible tool for folks. And then asking for permission for help and support. So do you need my help? I'm here if you need anything. Other ways accessibility show up. So the ADA is the bare minimum. And most people try to really just skirt by with that bare minimum. There's social media accessibility, there's event and outing accessibility, there's communications accessibility, website accessibility. There's a lot there, so I'm not going to go into that, but there's a link for folks to check out if you are in the website design space, and then 5 ways to promote disability in your life. And what I like to add is when you provide access to the most marginalized, again, around those margins in that pie that I showed you, you provide access to everyone in that circle. So that's kind of the idea, to provide accessibility to the most marginalized. Social media accessibility, which we can all take part in. So image and video description, which is part of the alt text feature on Instagram, Facebook, all these spaces, which you can write in what the photo looks like. A lot of the times a photo is not really described too well. If it's like a photo of me right now sitting, it would just say guy, red jacket. So just trying to describe it a little bit more so a person with a visual impairment can kind of be there with us instead of feeling excluded. High color contrast with texts in posts or stories. So within this presentation, you may have noticed that I'm only using black and white, not many other colors, because black and white is a big color contrast. transcripts of video or podcasts. So again, if you are doing videos, podcasts, like having captioning, having transcripts, it is a lot of work, and it does cost a bit. So those resources are tricky to get to, but if you are capable of doing that, that'd be awesome. Video captioning, I believe captioning is turned on for this. So similar, creating video captioning. This is a very unique one for Instagram and Facebook. Capitalizing the first letter of every word in a hashtag. It's called camel case. So you just, as you see, the C and the C are both capital. For a lot of folks that use screen readers, the screen reader would read that now as camel case instead of just one word, as like one gibberish word. So things to watch out for there. Event and outing accessibility. Again, never hurts to ask. So in your RSVP forms, what are your accessibility needs? Great question to ask. Keep it blank. Just keep it an open-ended question. So folks with disabilities can write in what they need. If folks read that and don't really know what that means, then they don't probably need any kind of accessibility need in that sense. So when a person with a disability sees or reads that, they will know that this event is helping to promote accessibility. Does your venue provide elevators or ramp access? That's kind of a simple one to check out. What does accessible transportation routes to and from your venue look like? So, maybe, the event you're putting on is fully accessible, and the way that the person is coming into town is fully accessible through the airport or the train station, but getting from the airport to this train station or airport or train station to the event might not be accessible. Things like Uber and Lyft now have an accessible option, which is awesome. They have wheelchair accessible vans, which do not cost any more than the normal rides. So that's super cool. And then another thing, if you're doing a outing, what do the trails look like? Length of trail, conditions of the trail, group size. Of course, COVID is dropping that. But for folks that might be on the autism spectrum, might get overwhelmed with a lot of people, the grade, the steepness of the hike, if there is a medical aid user out there that wants to come on the hike with you all. Campground accessibility, of course, making sure that the bathrooms are accessible, the pathways are accessible, all these things that come into play. Is there accessible parking again? That's super important around campgrounds, around trailheads, around anything. And hopefully there's enough of it for folks to be able to use. Is there enough seating and personal space? So again, for folks that have autism or have sensory input disorders, might not want to be around too many people at once. So being mindful of that, if that is an accessibility need. And did you confirm access days before your event? So disabled folks are very, very self-reliant when it comes to running into a barrier. And we tend to know what to do when we do. So, but if we are told that this space is accessible, we want proof that it is accessible through photos, videos, descriptions, anything. I've been to spaces that say they're fully accessible and then they have staircases with no accessible option to go around them. So things to, watch out for there. Communication accessibility, again, just like an anti-racism statement that a lot of companies are putting out there now, a general accessibility statement is also great to put out there, trying to promote disabled voices through their marketing, through their leadership, through anything in this intersectional way of like improving it with racism or race, disability, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, anything. Not putting disability last in anything. Again, when we center access, when we provide access, when we look at access right off the bat, we're going to start including a lot of people into these conversations. So when we start incorporating disability right off the bat instead of retrofitting it into the end, we're going to start providing access to everyone within that pie that I showed earlier. So great way to try to start promoting that in your spaces, in your organizations, in your day-to-day lives, whatever. Using an RSVP form to gather attendees needed ahead of time, asking about dietary restrictions, that's a form of food access, interpreters, assisted devices, again, ways for, the media access, requirements for accessible parking and seating, that physical access, open text areas asking about accommodations. So having an individual that is like the access liaison or coordinator, that a disabled person, if I were to go to an event, can quickly go to ask about accessibility around the venue, in the area, in the vicinity, in the city, in the campground, etc. Pronouns as also another way of providing access to people's gender and sexual orientation. So all of this starts intersecting as we start reading into it more and more. And then sending emails around accessible transportation options, disclosing any specifics in your pre-event communications around the accessibility or the inaccessibility. We want to know what is accessible and what isn't, so we can prepare ourselves. We still prepare ourselves regardless. Let your speakers know about any special accommodations beforehand. Again, that comes with talking with people, having those forums, having those questions, asking them. Don't be uncomfortable asking them. We are very much open to sharing what we need to make sure our livelihood is taken care of. And then 5 ways we can promote disability. I always tell people, think globally, act locally. So there are a lot of local organizations in everyone's state, town, whatever. So highly recommend clicking Move United chapters. That's a combination of Disabled Sports USA and Adaptive Sports USA. They combined and created Move United. It's a great place for resource, knowledge sharing, job opportunities, understanding what disability is, anything like that. Creating physical accommodations is always super important. And then allowing flexible and telecommunications. We're doing it right now through Zoom. Disability justice advocates were sharing this, always saying that we needed to be able to use telecommunications to go to work, to go to class, to do all these things. But now that, more privileged folks are getting impacted by COVID, can't go to work, can't go to class, can't make money, etc., then the telecommunications comes in, not when, again, those marginalized voices are constantly speaking up about it. But now that we are being flexible, allowing telecommunications to happen and take space in any of these outings, any of these experiences. So provide open support networks, again, working with these partners that you might create and providing that accommodations. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And another last thing is patience, love, and understanding that you're not going to be in my shoes. You're not going to be in a person with a disability shoes, person with a wheelchair shoes, but you can always try to learn through patience and understanding that, everyone's lived experience is different. So, and we just have to understand where they're coming from when it comes to their needs. And then I'll leave you with this. This is a quote by Stella Young. Disability doesn't make you exceptional, but questioning what you think you know about it does. Highly recommend folks to watch her TED Talk called I'm Not Your Inspiration. Thank you very much. She talks a lot about disability, the objectification of disability for the benefit of non-disabled folks, and what she quotes as inspiration porn. I won't go into that one because that's its own topic. But yeah, highly recommend folks to watch that. And then this is kind of the end. So these are a bunch of folks that you can follow, a bunch of organizations you can follow that might start expanding your narrative around adaptive sports, around disability justice, around disabled voices around the country. So great resource to have to just see what kind of world is out there and just, burst out of our bubbles a little bit more. And I believe that's it. Yeah, that's my presentation. Thanks. I'm more than happy to open it up to questions. It is almost 8 o'clock. So sorry about that. I knew it was going to go a little bit over than expected, but yeah, more than happy to answer a few questions. And yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vasu. That was an amazing presentation. And I think that's going to help me personally reframe how I think about outdoor spaces and accessibility. And I think it'll help us reassess how we approach things as outdoor adventures as well. I hope everybody enjoyed that. Tamiko and I prepped a couple questions that we can open up with. And if anybody else has anything they would like to ask Vasu, feel free to drop it into the chat and then we'll read it out to him. Yeah, Tamiko, would you like to open it up?
Yeah, I'm gonna start with the hefty one. Okay, so Vasu, my apologies earlier when I kind of choked up. I was really giddy in meeting you. My excitement was due to so many layers of overlaps and intersectionalities. So as a person of color and also a person of different disabilities, I wear hearing aids, they're over there, so thank you for the captions and other things. I know that those two have interacted to shape the kind of person that I am today. And I was wondering if you could kind of describe how that's affected you. I know you've gave examples of how things overlap in what you do today, but I guess I was more wondering in your upcoming.
Yeah, I mean, definitely impacted me heavily. I'm not unaware of the identities that I hold as a disabled person of color, man of color, cisgender, person of color. So, and I mean, the idea is to start, my idea is that I'm still pretty young. I'm only 29, but I've definitely run headfirst into the social justice world and definitely noticed the lack of representation within even a space that thinks they're woke around disability, and just understanding that there's a ton of ableism that shows up even in spaces that are focusing on liberation. So trying to start bridging these gaps between a lot of different spaces that so we can start really including again those marginalized voices that are in that pie, around on the circumference into these spaces, so all of our voices are being heard. And that's kind of what I started noticing around my ethnicity and race, and then my disability as well, is that it's kind of hard to find a person of color and a disabled person in the snow sports world, let alone even the outdoor space. So, I can only name a handful of folks of color that are really showing up and being loud in these spaces that identify as such. So just trying to start expanding people's narrative and showcasing how many organizations are out there doing this work around access, especially to the outdoors. There's 400 or 500 different ones in the US alone that are trying to do that. And a lot of those same issues that impact communities of color also impact disabled communities as well. So there's a lot of intersections there. So when we start providing those same resources, we start seeing these different identities start popping up and, getting access to those resources and opportunities. So that's kind of how I've been starting to notice it. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. And then, yeah, just for the sake of time, I think we'll each just kind of go for 2 questions and then probably wrap it up then. So, Vasu, your role in getting involved in skiing, and you helped kind of introduce you to the outdoor world as a whole. For people who are interested in getting more involved in the outdoors, but don't necessarily have a family connection to help get themselves there, I wonder if you have any tips for people who are interested but don't currently feel like they see themselves represented or see an easy way to get involved.
Yeah, there's a I don't know if you all are aware of what affinity spaces are, but affinity spaces are spaces built on specific identity groups. So these organizations that are listed under organizations are technically affinity spaces for disabled folks. So there's a lot of, again, if you're disabled, I would highly recommend reaching out to any of these. Move United is kind of this umbrella organization that kind of encapsulates or is like kind of a hub, and you'll start seeing all these different chapters around the country. Could be a great resource for the folks with disabilities watching. And then for folks of color and queer folks, there's a huge movement around diversity and inclusion happening right now within the past couple of years. Folks like, let's see, Brown Girls Climb, Climbers of Color, Brown Girls Run, all these like different organizations that are popping up, and a way to find that on social. I mean, social media is a massive community organizer right now. There's, of course, its ups and downs around all the things that might happen on social media. But if you just type in Diversify Outdoors, the hashtag Diversify Outdoors, you'll start seeing all of these different communities and spaces start popping up. Diversify Van Life is another one. So like all these, there are a ton of spaces out there. It's just, of course, we're not as loud at the moment. We're getting louder. So more and more people in our day-to-day lives start noticing and realize that these are resources, these are opportunities. This is a way of providing that equal representation and why representation matters in that sense as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah. Do you have any other questions before?
There's one in the chat. Yeah. Do you see it? I read it out for you.
Yeah. How do you form partnerships with organizations that have accessibility skills? So are you saying organizations that are already based around disability? Is that correct?
Yeah, I guess that's the question. Or just in terms of, we talked about this a little bit at the very beginning, forming partnerships and alliances. I feel like people get siloed into spending time with people who have, their exact same cluster of identities. And so bridging those gaps, what are some steps that people and organizations can take?
Yeah, I mean, it's usually going in without an agenda is probably the best thing. I never want to be a savior in any space. White savior, more privileged, disabled savior, I guess. Just going in and like just having genuine conversations to see where these organizations are at and what support they need and how, you as a person or you as an organization can provide that support. Whether that's amplifying some of their work or amplifying a cause or a fundraiser that they might be doing, partnering with that, providing, maybe physical access, maybe tables, chairs, anything like that to be able to, create that trust. Just like how we build trust with friends is kind of the same that we build with organizations, is like just going in and not having any kind of agenda other than just like trying to be as genuine as possible and trying to be supportive and listen and kind of move together instead of creating this power dynamic. Like, I have the resources and you don't, so I make all the decisions. It's like, no, that's not how it works. Like, we want everyone's voice to be at the table, everyone to be heard. So that the decisions are made together and making sure that everyone is lifted up at the same time. Let's see. Yes, Xander, I think I'll keep this as the last question. Is that all right? Does that help?
That's gonna be good by me. I know Jim said that he might have a question as well, so maybe two more perhaps.
Okay, cool. Jim, you're in here. Let's see. Sasha. So, hey, Sasha, would you be able to say this out loud, just so we're able to have a conversation?
Yeah, sure. Great talk, by the way. Thank you. So I was just wondering what your opinion of organizations such as Outdoor Adventures or other outdoor organizations running events that were specifically for minority individuals, such as a BIPOC only hiking trip or a camping trip for people with disabilities. And what are ways that these organizations that might not exclusively focus on representation, how can we make these events as inclusive as possible?
Yeah, so I always tell people that leaders have to look the part of the participants. Otherwise, it is a power dynamic, regardless of the situation or however hard we try to make it less of a power dynamic. So, and the way that I always tell people is partnering with organizations that are already doing this work within maybe locally or nationally or regionally to just see if they would be interested in collaborating on, a affinity space-based hike around folks of color or disabled folks or queer folks, so that, there is this, resource sharing, but also there's a representation part as well when it comes to the leadership. So the participants that take part also see themselves in these leadership roles. So that's super helpful, and that's kind of a necessary means when it comes to building relationships and building these spaces and outings. And then as for what are some ways the outdoor organization or outdoors not necessarily centered on minority representation can make, I mean, the things I brought up, those access things, not only provide access to it provides access to everyone. It's not just for disabled folks. That's the idea, is like once we provide access to those, again, folks on the margins, we start providing access to everyone in that circle, in that pie. So that's kind of the idea, is just, basing it around these conversations around financial access or physical access or media access, any of these things that might come up, food access, anything. That's not going to only impact disabled folks. It's going to impact and start prioritizing the needs of other minorities and underrepresented communities as well. So that's hopefully that answers your question. I know there's a lot of different ways, but that's kind of just like what I've started noticing has been helping. Sweet. Cool. One more question, right? And we're good to go.
Jim, sweet. If you want to unmute yourself and go for it, we're ready for you.
If he's there.
Yeah, he might not be there. We'll see. Yeah. All right. I think we can go ahead and wrap it up then. Yeah. Huge thank you again to Vasu.
Jim was talking. He's just muted.
Got it.
There we go. Got it.
Oh, sorry guys, I'm muted. Hey. All right.
Yeah.
Got me now.
There we go.
I did that, you know me and computers. So yeah, the first time I met Vasu, we were at a climbing area and we were hiking down. It was a crappy trail, super slippery and muddy. And Vasu's right behind me, just like kind of right on my tail on a steep, slippery trail. And I'm in flip-flops and I slip. And Vasu says, Jim, what's up, man? You got 2 legs. You got this. Stay upright. And I kind of laughed. And it was a big icebreaker, like there, Vasu's sense of humor and his acknowledgement of I have 2 legs and he does not. So my question, Vasu, is that sort of acknowledgement that you made to me and other people were there. What is that? Like, do you always want to acknowledge it? Like, yeah, we all acknowledge our faults because it's funny. Not a fault. You're gonna kill me on my 3rd grade level of
oh, it's all good
understanding. But what's like you'll can me on my haircut. That everybody does. So yeah. We acknowledge like these things that are like maybe I'm different than you in some way. So when you did that, that was a huge deal for me and the rest of the group. Like, we get this. We all have our differences. Like, was I on point on that, or like?
Yeah, no, that's totally legit. I do that all the time. I try to make people uncomfortable with little things like that, but it's also like a learning experience, I believe. I mean, I've been put through that same test, not with a disabled person, but maybe a person of color. But I always think, and in this country, we have not acknowledged a lot of things, especially around different atrocities that have happened specifically to, Black and Indigenous people. And then like, same rhetoric getting pushed onto other people that might have other inequities happening in their lives. So I always think, acknowledging that is important. Acknowledging that I have a disability is important. Asking, not what's wrong with you, but like, hey, what's your story? Like, how did you lose your leg? Anything like that is super important in just breaking that ice. I know like a lot of adults, definitely, I go to the grocery store where they shush their kids when they're asking that same question. Because again, there's this stigma around disability being a bad thing, which is not the case, as I said in this presentation. So the idea is like acknowledging it, moving forward, and knowing like, cool, like he can hike this trail, but he might need help like carrying, again, that water or that food or that heavy backpack from one crag to the other. So like little things like that would start like, turning the gears in our brains to ask the right questions at the right time. And that doesn't only come towards disabled folks. It also goes towards communities of color. It goes towards queer folks, all these different, identity spaces that we are a part of. So that's kind of the base around it. I just try to bring some sort of humor to it.
Good work, buddy.
Sweet. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thanks for the connection, Jim. That was super cool. But yeah, appreciate everyone. Feel free to reach out. I'm always answering people in my DMs on Instagram, so feel free to reach out on Instagram, and we can kind of keep the conversation rolling if folks have more questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And again, I think this was an amazing way to hopefully introduce everybody to this conversation. Hopefully these are conversations that we can continue in our own lives moving forward. So thank you, Vasu, for joining us. Thank you, Tomiko, as well, and the Mixed Student Union. And thanks to all of you for joining. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Sweet. Take care, guys. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. You as well.
Yeah.